Well, thank you very much. It's an honor to be invited here to speak with you tonight. And I am the current president of ASCO, and I'm going to talk to you about some of the issues that I'm used to speaking to physicians about, but I know this is a slightly different audience and hopefully get some different perspectives. So here's our polling question. Thriving while adapting to the dynamic changes in healthcare require practice-changing transformations. Identify which is the most important to your organization. So there's no right or wrong answer. This is a poll. Interesting. So a lot of different issues to talk about. We're going to talk about some of these today. So I'm going to talk about this from the physician standpoint and trying to looking toward the future and from the patient-centered standpoint, because that's really what we're all here for. So the ideal, what this picture demonstrates from Norman Rockwell, portrays really the best of medicine, and the reason why myself and most of my colleagues went into medicine, trying to take care of the patient and trying to look back to old times where, in the day it really mattered what the patient felt, what the patient wanted, and we need to try to get back to that. We're all here to help the patient. So this is the ideal in a practice to have interaction with the patient, to, in this case, try to make the little girl happy by listening to the heart from the doll. Unfortunately, this is kind of the reality sometimes in our daily practice as physicians, that there's not the time to have the patient interaction, and we're dealing with a lot of administrative burden. This slide shows a lot of paper charts. Of course, that's not really realistic anymore. Most of it's computer charts, and that's even worse because the computer charts actually take more time, even if you're proficient in that. So we need to try to take it back to the patient, see how we can try to decrease some of the administrative burden, and make sure that the physicians are not just data entry clerks, because unfortunately that's sometimes what we feel like. There's polls that ASCO does every year, and in a workforce analysis, and trying to look at really what's going on in oncologists' lives. And in a recent poll, it was found that oncologists, for about a third of oncologists, feel an increased amount of burnout. And a lot of this in the poll was due to some of this administrative burden and not being able to really take care of the patient in the way that we would like to. So how can we try to improve upon this? Well, these are really the goals that all of us want from any aspect, and that's to try to look at better care experience for the patient, better care itself for the patient, taking care of whatever problem they may have, improved health, making sure that we not only treat disease, prevent disease, and to do that in a value-based manner or with low cost. And that's really the goal of all of us in healthcare, to try to get back to these types of national goals. But of course, that's not so easy. How do we get from these lofty goals to really taking care of those, and how do we get from here to there? And that's what we're going to try to address a little bit today in this talk. There's no single solution, and we didn't get to where we are in one day. This is over time. But we want to look at, of course, practice-based medicine, trying to look at the positive changes in healthcare, trying to make sure that we're looking at evidence-based medicine. That is, anything that we're doing really has data to go behind it, to make sure that we're looking at clinical trial information or evidence-based medicine. Trying to look at the efficiency of resources, making sure that we're using our resources wisely and not having duplication of services, or trying to make sure that whatever resources we do use are appropriate for that patient. And of course, quality measurement. We all have an idea of what quality is. A lot of the quality measures that we use right now are process measures, but we will need to try to get the quality measures back to actually helping the patient measures in addition to some of the process measures. We want to try to engage and support the practices to make sure that whatever changes we're doing, whatever modifications, are not duplicating what they're already doing, or trying to make sure that we're improving the engagement of the patients in practice into making sure that we can improve the healthcare for our patients in a value-based manner. And of course, innovation. Anytime that we want to try to improve the outcomes, we want to try to innovate. Oncology is built on innovation, and this is how we come up with all of our new treatments. But of course, we want the new treatments to be able to make sure that we can do that in a value-based manner. So how can we do this, and do this in a way that we can use our healthcare dollars wisely? Of course, I think we're all aware that CMS is trying to move away from fee-based service. And really, this has been looked at for a number of different years by all different aspects, that fee-based service is really not the best way of healthcare, because of course, if you have fee-based service, the more you do, the more you get, the more you have to get paid. And we want to make sure that we can try to have the top-level healthcare for our patients, perhaps in an alternative way, and move away from fee-for-service. This, of course, is a very ambitious goal, and HHS's goal is by 2018 to have 50% of all Medicare payments on alternative payment models. This is going to be a tough one because really there aren't any alternative payment models for the most part now, outside of a few pilot projects. And we need to make sure that we can make sure the alternative payment models are realistic and that they actually provide the improvement for patients that we're discussing. So we're going to go over a little bit of the information about this, and I don't think that by 2018, unfortunately, 50% is going to be possible. So what's the bottom line here? We want to ensure patient-centered care. We want to ensure value care based upon evidence-based medicine. Now in oncology, evidence-based medicine is really to the forefront, and clinical trials is how we have all of the treatments that we've found for patients, really based upon clinical information from the trials, from evidence-based medicine. And we need to take that back into high-valued patient-centered care. What is value? We're going to talk about this a little bit later as well. But value is not only what the patient's outcome is, it's also looking at the cost and the toxicities for whatever treatment that we're doing. And we have to put that into a big value-based system to make sure we're doing the right thing for the patient. Quality monitoring is all part of that value-based care proposition. Again, we want to get away from just process-based, ticking the boxes. We want to make sure that value-based care actually improves the patient outcome in these three domains. And we want to learn from whatever we do as far as making new systems. It doesn't really help if we do all these changes, but we don't learn from what we've done to take back into the process and improve patient care. And that's what happens a lot nowadays. Unfortunately, we make some small changes or big changes, but we don't necessarily learn from that and take that to a bigger patient population. So I'm going to talk about some of the ways we're trying to gather larger patient-based information to take that back for further modifications. So evidence-based practice. All of oncology really is based upon clinical trial data, but unfortunately only about 3% of patients go on clinical trials, adult oncology patients. It's higher in pediatric oncology. But that's really the basis of many of the treatments that we do. So a lot of what we do is based upon clinical guidance, that is some information based upon publications or based upon, in some cases, just thought leader information. And we need to make sure that we're understanding all of this and that these options we're giving patients, really there's data behind that. And of course, once we learn the data, we want to take it back to the providers, to the physicians, to the healthcare team in an education module. And we want to make sure that we're learning from everything we're doing. I'm going to talk a little bit later about a large big data project that we're doing through ASCO called Cancer Link. And that's to try to learn from the 97% of patients that don't go on clinical trials, information that we can take back to other patients in similar situations and learn from that so that we can improve this feedback loop to patients to improve their outcomes in a value-based care fashion. Right now, most of the quality measurements are really, as I mentioned, process, and they're performance improvement, but it's in a process mode. COPI is the modality that we have through ASCO, that's the Information and Quality Improvement Project, and that's really looked at performance measurement and feedback. There's an additional step that practices can do through COPI certification that in addition to the process measures that we look at in different disease modalities and different processes in oncology, also has site visits involved in that so that we can make sure that the processes such as chemotherapy administration, safety, and other processes meet the COPE certification and safety information program. It also provides mentorship to different activities through different physician practices to be sure that we're learning from each other and that we're taking these improvements forward. So quality improvement includes not only processes, but also includes quality training per program, learning from each other, and trying to make sure we're collaborative. So how has ASCO improved some of these efficiencies? There are a number of ways that we're looking at value-based medicine. I think you may be all familiar with the Choosing Wisely campaign, and ASCO participated in this. And the Choosing Wisely campaign is to try to look at different specialty societies, and they looked at different treatments or tests or procedures that they do, and tried to choose, the first round was 5, and there was a second round of an additional 5, that maybe were not the best options for patients in a value-based system. So just one example of that in my own area of lymphoma research, and something that we've done for a number of years actually at our institution, was that in circumstances where a patient appears to be cured of lymphoma, an aggressive lymphoma like diffuse large B-cell or Hodgkin's lymphoma, it's not recommended that routine CAT scans or PET scans are done for surveillance after their treatment in the Choosing Wisely campaign. And there's also a lot of other similar types of treatments or tests that are either approved or are discontinued in the Choosing Wisely campaign for different types of malignancies, because they really haven't been shown to get relapses early or predict for outcome for patients. So I think as we continue to be more critical of our treatments and our surveillance and our tests, that this will improve the value for our patients. PracticeNet is also a service that just recently has been started through ASCO, and this is through the Clinical Affairs Department, which is a new department here, and Steve Grubbs is actually the head of the department. He's here today, and I'm sure he'd be happy to answer any questions for you. But PracticeNet is a suite of services that we've just started recently to try to help practices to have value-based care and to have processes that can improve the outcome for patients and improve their efficiency of the practice, and try to learn from each other again to make sure that everyone is doing the best practices that we can for oncology. Another thing that we all have learned is team-based care is really important in oncology. And this is going to be very true because, unfortunately, we know that there is going to be a big shortage of oncologists over the next decades. As we increase the number of patients who are diagnosed with cancer with aging of our population, the number of oncologists needed is going to be much higher than what we're supplying, unfortunately. So team-based care is going to be ultimately very important in oncology, and of course is today as well. Another area that we've been very involved with in ASCO is ASCO's value framework. And this has been published in June 2015 in the Journal of Clinical Oncology, and certainly you can go look at that. But trying to look at supportive decision-making with the patient and with the provider in looking at different treatment options for their treatment for malignancies. This is trying to look at not only the therapeutic benefit, what's the outcome for the patient, what's their remission rate, what's their survival rate, but also looking at toxicities of the treatment and trying to compare those, as well as costs of the treatment. And this is put together in what's called a net health benefit for individual treatments, and this is meant to be used for randomized clinical trial data in looking at a standard of care option versus the newer option, or versus two different standard of care treatment options for a specific area, specific malignancy. This is very important for patients and for physicians in trying to speak with patients. It's often difficult that we don't have a lot of this data when we speak with patients, and we use a lot of information that's perhaps from published manuscripts, but it's difficult to have a direct comparator that's really there in front of the patient. So we're working on different ways to utilize this, as far as a technology and app perhaps that could be used in front of the patient, different ways to use this and to define this. And this is trying to get at individual patient goals and circumstances that may be nuanced in that individual patient. We published this, as I mentioned, in June of 2015, and we asked for feedback, and we have received over 400 individual people or groups that have given us back information, and to refine this and to improve upon this, and I'm sure we'll be coming out with version 2.0 in the next year or so to try to improve upon this. So, okay. So MACRA, I'm sure many of you know what MACRA is, the Medicare Access and CHIP Reauthorization Act, repealed the SGR, which was good because the SGR sustained growth rate was a problem for physician fees. That was passed this past year, but has brought in a whole new area that we need to learn about. Now, typically when I go talk to physician groups, really no one has heard of MACRA and no one has heard of kind of the details of MACRA. So I'm just going to take a little poll in the audience today. Who has heard of MACRA as far as being passed? Yeah. So you guys are way above the physician groups when I speak with them. So the best of ASCO this summer, it was kind of late August I spoke, and there was a room full of 400 physicians, and 2 of those 400 physicians had heard of this. So I assumed that this audience would be much higher. So in looking at MACRA, it's going to have a huge change, but that also creates a huge opportunity for us in trying to improve upon the care for our patients. So MIPS, of course, is part of MACRA, and trying to look at the merit-based incentive payment system. And so physicians would be able to choose either MIPS as a modality or choose an alternative payment model. And trying to look at that and trying to get this information out has really proved to be quite interesting in the oncology, as I'm sure in everywhere else. So this is a whole new way to look at performance measurement, and in this way there'll be some penalties or bonuses, and I'll go over that in just a minute as far as what the percentages are. And the bonus size really depends on how many people get penalties, because the pie is really the same, it just is shifted in different ways. This also provides public reporting on physicians' outcomes and comparison, which physicians are really uncomfortable with. And this is something that is going to have to be, I think, information out there to physicians so they understand what this is and get this comfortable with this concept. There will be a few exceptional practices that will have be able to have a 10% bonus funded from this, but that's going to be a very small number of practices that get to that exceptional site. So MIPS is really going to have a very significant impact upon the physician payment program. So this just looks at some of these areas that are going to be important in the MIPS as far as resource utilization, quality reporting, the electronic health record and meaningful use, and clinical improvement. And there's a composite score that would be based upon these 4 domains to get the threshold. And the threshold will either provide an upside of up to plus 27%, so that's significant there, or a downside of minus 9%. This information, again, is going to be gathered starting in 2017 for implementation in 2019. And so really that's coming up before you know it, and we really need to get on this as far as getting practices prepared for this. We need tools to be able to help with this gap in coordination of care and some of the other gaps that we see on this that we really don't have today. So these are the relative percentages in MIPS, and looking at meaningful use, the quality, PQRS, resource use, and clinical improvement, patient satisfaction and coordination of care. Now some of these things we're pretty used to, like the meaningful use now, I think most practices are used to, but this is now pulled all into one category with all of these other domains. Particularly the coordination of care and some of the infrastructure that we currently don't have available, I think is going to be one thing that the physicians are going to be finding very difficult in the MIPS program. So some unintended consequences and issues that we need to think about this. There may be an inadvertent penalization for high performers. That is, if the practices are already performing at a very high level, there's really no improvement that they can do or minimal improvement. And so they may be unintentionally penalized by this because they can't get an improvement in their percentage. There's a really big issue with ongoing infrastructure costs and requirements that are covered. So basically under the MIPS program, you have to have a medical home, in this case an oncology medical home. And a lot of the things that are required under a medical home are very difficult. So you have to have 24-hour care with respect to the patient not going to the emergency room, other very highly supportive care services, and there's not a lot of infrastructure that's supported through this system to be able to do that. Also in attribution, so if it's a multi-specialty care for the patient, we want to make sure that the attribution goes to the physician group or the physician that has that attribution for that care of that patient. And it may be difficult to find in the MIPS system. And then how do we measure these things? Outcomes, that's not as hard to measure with respect to outcomes for the disease. Outcomes for quality is processed mostly right now, but we need to make sure that we're measuring the right outcomes for this. We want to make sure that we're sharing the shared decision-making with the patient and the provider. Care coordination is a huge issue that we need to make sure that we have adequate resources for, and making sure that if we are requiring certain things, that it's not an unsupported mandate, and making sure that we can do these things based upon the MIPS system. So oncology practices really face significant challenges right now. With the macro coming out is really a significant time for change in oncology. As I mentioned, there's going to be a massive increase of patients with the aging of our population and a workforce shortage. And so at the same time, we're having all of these changes along with electronic health care, records, and many other things. It's been very difficult for oncology as well as other physicians. So, the world of oncology is really changing. There's a lot of new products in the pipeline, which is great for the physicians, great for the patients, but we need to understand how to use those products and treatments and making sure that we can provide everything that we need for our patients. And as we talked about earlier, cancer is not one disease, it's hundreds or really thousands of diseases based upon all the information that we know. And we're not really looking at cancer of the breast or cancer of the lung or other things anymore. We're looking at these pathways or genomic analyses that are going to really revolutionize the treatment that we do for patients. There's going to be 1.7 million new cancer diagnoses in 2015, but as we go through the next several decades, as the aging of our population, particularly in the US, this is going to be massively increasing the number of patients diagnosed with cancer. And of course, as screening and other new tests get improved, we may even find more. And thankfully, a lot of our treatments are really doing much better in that we have a lot more cancer survivors. So we have to look at side effects, both short and long term for cancer survivors, and we have to make sure we have survivorship plans and be able to understand how to take care of these patients long term. So this can't be just the oncologist because of the workforce shortage. It has to be primary care and other healthcare providers that help us to take care of these short and long term cancer survivors. Practices have a lot of pressure now and in the future. And this is from a survey that was done from the ASCO annual census that we do every year looking at different practices. And we've done this for the last several years. Practices have increased the number that they have done this, and so we're getting pretty accurate information now and seeing over time the changes. This looks at the different pressures that we're seeing from payers, costs of drugs, competitive pressures, looking at drug pricing, staffing, clinical research issues. So you can see, based upon the color coding here, physician-owned practices have a lot more pressure from payers, from cost and drug pricing. And academic centers, for example, have a lot more pressure based upon clinical research, as that's really one of their top priorities there. So it may be different in different types of practices, but you can see over time this really increasing a lot, the different pressures that oncology practices are having. Of special concern are small practices, and this is a small practice would be defined as 1 to 5 oncologists. And this has really, over the years, been the backbone of U.S. oncology care delivery system. Particularly in the southern United States, there's a high number of these small practices. But you can see, because of some of the changes that we're doing, smaller practices are more and more likely to either go under, to close completely, to sell to hospital-based systems, or to merge to make a much larger system. And over time, this has been a definite increase in this, in particular the last few years. So there's a major concern that we're really modifying the face of oncology. Also, there's just information overload, everything we've already talked about today, from genomics and patient-specific genomic care to new treatments. We have many new treatments that are in clinical trials and are FDA approved every year, and the oncologist needs to keep up on all of that. It's very difficult when you even just specialize in one area, like I do in lymphoma, but when you have to see patients with all different types of malignancies, it's really difficult to keep up with the information overload, as well as all of the practice-changing things we've talked about today as well. And the other area really is administrative overload, and this has really come to the forefront over the last several years. There's a lot of problems with, of course, everyone's trying to look at how we can decrease costs and increase value for patients. So a lot of programs, a lot of insurance companies have come up with specific pathways that they want you to use, and it may be different for the different patients. So this is just one example from a practice that was looked at from ASCO, and they actually had 8 to 10 different pathways that they had to follow based upon the patient's insurance. And so they described, the people that went to this practice described that they had old-fashioned clipboards where they had different color-coded things for the different payers, and they had to do a different pathway for each individual payer based upon what payer that patient had. So as you can see, this in fact doesn't really decrease costs very much in the big picture for the overall management of this of a large volume of patients, because of the administrative increased burden for the physician practice, and it really is a problem that we're going to have to face. So ASCO is trying to provide support for this. This is, as we talked about earlier, ASCO's PracticeNet are trying to provide tools to support and guide transformation to improve efficiency in these practices, and provide business analytics to try to see if this can't be improved, and also quality improvement, and learn from each other. This is something that we can take best practices forward and try and make sure that we're helping all of the oncology practices with this. A wide range of tools and sharing of information will improve this. The other area that we have been very involved with is trying to look at patient-centered oncology payment, or alternative payment systems in oncology. And this is something that we published again and are getting information back on. And this really took 2 years for a wide variety, large group of people to put together to see if we could come up with an alternative payment program for oncology. This really is trying to match support to what's provided for the patient, so that we're not cost shifting over to drug charges for all of the support that we're not, all the programs that we're not supported for, and really tries to take advantage of trying to support the exact programs that patients need, such as supportive care, such as all the information that we give to patients, making sure that we have time for education, additional support for clinical trials, that sort of thing, and making sure that the follow-up of patients is matched to the treatment as well as the additional follow-up that we need. This is a very big collaborative project, and again, we're getting feedback on this and trying to be innovative, and we'll data share, of course, as well, to try to see that if there's improvements that can be made. But we can't do this alone. We really need to work together to do this, to match our goals to the patient's goals, and making sure that we're bridging that difference between the payers and the providers and the patients, to make sure we can use our collective wisdom to do the right thing for patients, get the treatment they need in a value-based manner. So what are some examples of ways that we could maybe make some improvements? A couple of slides on this. So for example, pathways. I mentioned earlier that there is a wide variety in practice, and many of the different insurers are complying with as many as 8 to 10 different pathways for one disease, like breast cancer. So there's not one right treatment or one wrong treatment, but it's difficult to say that for each different insurer we want to follow a different pathway. And there's also some lack of transparency based upon this information. It's difficult to get this information based upon the different providers, and causes a huge administrative burden for the practices, for the physicians, for the teams to be able to make sure that we can comply with this and get the patient's care paid for. Maybe we can agree upon a different way to do this, to try to look at what are high-quality programs, to allow practices to select one high-quality program, so one perhaps pathway that's been certified, and if treatment is on the pathway, that pre-authorization for drugs is not necessary, or that there's a streamlined program for pre-authorization of drugs. So it's often, it takes a long time to be able to do this, and of course increases the administrative burden for the practices to get pre-authorization for all of these different treatments or tests or drugs. And for example, at our center, we have to do pre-authorization for every single chemotherapy drug. Also, we want to try to improve upon value measures. Today, it's mostly process-driven, as I talked about earlier. There's lack of uniformity, and it's really inconsistent across different systems. It'd be nice to be able to agree upon measures that show value in oncology and making sure we're all using those measures to be consistent, and that we're also looking at different attributions to the cost of the care. We want to try to share the information and making sure there's process improvement and quality improvement, and making sure that we're all trying to work together on this information. But the future really lies in sharing information and making sure that we can improve upon this and in a rapid learning system. So what's a rapid learning system? We believe that we need to learn from every patient, and making sure that we're taking that information back to future patients to make sure that we can improve the care of every patient. So 3 challenges that we're looking at is, of course, we talked about earlier, the genomic testing and finding new ways to test drugs according to molecular characteristics of the tumors. And there's lots and lots of different trials that are looking at this. We talked about the NCI MATCH trial, the ASCO's TAPER trial. So I just learned this week actually that the NCI MATCH trial already accrued 500 patients, and they have closed accrual to that trial, or at least halted accrual until they can get all of the data from the molecular testing done. It accrued way ahead of schedule. What we don't know, of course, is the percentage of patients that are going to have useful information from the genetic testing. And prior trials have had a very low percentage, as we talked about earlier, with genetic information that could be actually helpful in getting a specific treatment for a patient. The ASCO TAPER trial that's going to be starting hopefully after the first of the year is really a registry in some respects to try to gather all the information on patients that are treated off clinical trials right now, but with these off-label drugs based upon molecular analysis. So it's trying to gather all the molecular analysis on patients and try to see if we can match them to some specific drugs that have been provided by pharmaceutical companies based upon that information, and then gather the information back to help future patients. Unfortunately, only 3% of patients, as I mentioned, adult oncology patients go in clinical trials, so we really need to learn from every patient, and that other 97% that don't go on trials. And big data is the way to do that, and ASCO's Cancer Link Information project is really the way that we're going to try to do that over the next several years. We really want to harvest that data to be able to take that back to future patients and gather information. You know, the problem of patients on clinical trials is, unfortunately, that they're not very representative of patients that we see in everyday practice. So patients on clinical trials are typically much younger than we see in everyday practice, and don't really represent the type of patient that walks into our door. So only 25% of patients over age 65 on clinical trials, whereas patients that walk in the door, 61% are over age 65. And the median age of most patients with cancer, of course, is in their 60s or 70s. The patients that walk in our door are less healthy. They don't have as good organ function. As you know, most of the clinical trials have very high bars for organ function and other entry criteria that make them really not compatible with what we see every day in practice. And the patients we see every day also are much more diverse than in clinical trials. Most of the patients that go on clinical trials are Caucasian, whereas there's much higher diversity in average cancer patients that walk through our door. So clinical trials are very good. They provide very good information, but they're not necessarily applicable to all of our patients, and we need real-world data to find that out. So when fully developed, CancerLink will analyze medical records from that other 97% of patients not on trials, try to uncover patterns that can improve patient care, and that can be from the quality standpoint. We're going to be able to gather quality information as well as toxicity information and outcome information. It'll also provide guidance to identify specific best evidence for care based upon a clear care plan for a patient, looking at side effects, of course, and treatment outcomes, and provide insight for the data exploration and hypothesis generation. So let's say that in the real world, patients with lymphoma are being treated with drug X, whereas it's not necessarily something that is approved for lymphoma, but there's a very high response rate for that drug that may form a hypothesis that we want to take then into a larger clinical trial to be able to gather further information and genomic information to try to see if we can improve the outcome for those patients. So CancerLink is just really getting started. We have 15 what we call Vanguard practices or beta testing sites that are going to be up and going over this next year. And they're geographically dispersed around the country. There's different types of practices. There's smaller private practices. There's hospital-based systems. There's academic centers. And we're going to have roughly about 350 to 400 physicians in those practices. And we're hoping for records of 500,000 to 1 million patients that we're going to have accessed over this next year. That information is going to be able to be analyzed for a lot of the things we just talked about, toxicities, for outcomes, for quality improvement, and be able to then formulate the information we can take back to future patients and hypothesis generation for future analysis, as well as outcomes data. So, really the future is harvesting our collective wisdom to look what we can do to improve patient care for oncology. The patient needs to be the center of everything we're doing. Everything that all of us are doing is to help the improvement of the patient's outcome, decrease their side effects from their treatment, and deliver that in a value-based care. And that isn't one physician or one healthcare provider that does that, but a whole ecosystem that we have to serve the patients. And these are just some of the patients, some of the pieces in that ecosystem. Certainly medical oncology, surgical oncology, radiation oncology, advanced practice providers that we have to help us, especially in the upcoming oncology shortage, supportive care services, financial, research, nursing, and of course, important payers and providers working together to improve outcome for our patients. We all play a role in this ecosystem, the patient's at the center, but we have to make sure that we're working together to improve the outcome for patients in the future. And by doing some of these things, we'll be able to improve the value-based care for patients, provide improvement in their outcomes, and hopefully over the next several decades, we'll be able to make sure that we can increase the survivors that we're already increasing today. I'm really hopeful that 50 years from now that we'll look back and that either we or our children will look back and say that there's been improvement in care, and everything that we did today can be taken into the future to help patients down the road. Thank you very much. I'd be more than happy to answer any questions.
So the TAPER trial, I think many people feel, is really an unbelievably fantastic inroad for ASCO, really offering its first clinical trial I think that ASCO's ever run on its own. Can we expect to see more ASCO clinical trials beyond TAPER and to other things?
Well, the TAPER trial is going to have kind of a pilot in an area in Michigan first. That's where it's going to launch, and then we're hoping to, take that more nationally. I guess we'll have to see how that goes, and what the infrastructure is and how that works out. But I think that we want to provide services that our patients and oncologists and oncology healthcare systems need, and we saw that as a big need and wanted to take that forward. Everybody at ASCO is full of really great ideas. We can't do all of them, unfortunately, but that was one that we really wanted to take forward. So I think we'll see how it goes and go from there. Okay, well, I'll be around for the rest of the night, so thank you very much. I'd be happy to answer any questions later during the reception. Thank you.